A young woman, just 27 years old, found herself in a situation that would haunt her for weeks. She was the youngest employee at a highly competitive sales company work training that weekend. The company had put everyone up in a hotel for a day-long presentation about quarterly goals. The atmosphere was intense. Sales is cutthroat, and the group consisted mostly of older, more experienced employees who had been with the company for years. She was the newcomer, the youngest, the one still trying to prove herself. After a grueling full day of meetings and presentations, a few colleagues decided to decompress over dinner at a restaurant down the street from the hotel. They carpooled together, laughing and unwinding after the pressure of the day. When they arrived at the restaurant, they noticed one of the older employees, Deborah, a woman in her 50s, already standing at the bar. She looked comfortable there, drink in hand, her posture relaxed in a way it hadn't been during the meetings. The young woman and her colleagues invited Deborah to join them for dinner. Deborah declined politely, preferring to stay at the bar. They thought nothing of it and moved on with their evening. The young woman had 2 beers with her meal, nothing excessive, just enough to take the edge off the day. As they finished eating and prepared to leave, they noticed something alarming. Deborah was still at the bar. But she was no longer the composed professional they'd seen earlier. She was stumbling even though the ground was perfectly level. Her words were slurred, her movements uncoordinated. It was clear she was plastered, dangerously intoxicated. As the group left the restaurant, Deborah followed them outside. The young woman watched with growing concern as Deborah reached into her purse and pulled out her car keys. The woman's heart dropped. There was no way Deborah could drive in this condition. Without hesitation, she stepped forward and stopped Deborah gently but firmly. "I'll drive you back to the hotel," she said. It was the only responsible thing to do. Deborah agreed without much protest. But as she moved toward the passenger door of her car, something terrible happened. She reached for the door handle and missed completely. Her balance gave out. She fell straight backward onto the pavement, and the back of her head struck the concrete with a sickening sound, like someone had dropped a carton of eggs onto the ground. The sound echoed in the parking lot. Everyone froze. The young woman rushed over and knelt beside Deborah. She checked for consciousness. Deborah was passed out cold. And she was bleeding. Blood was pooling beneath her head where it had struck the pavement. This wasn't a minor fall. This was a serious head injury. Panic rippled through the group. The young woman grabbed her phone and immediately dialed 911. But before she could finish explaining the situation to the dispatcher, one of the younger male colleagues stopped her. "Wait," he said urgently. "Help me get her in the car. We'll get her room key out of her purse and just put her in bed. She'll sleep it off." The young woman stared at him in disbelief. "But she has a head injury," she said, her voice rising with urgency. "She's bleeding. What if she cracked her skull?" She wasn't a doctor, but she knew enough to understand that sleeping with a head injury could be fatal. Hadn't she learned that in school? If someone goes to sleep with a serious head injury, there's a real chance they won't wake up. Some of the other employees agreed with her. They could see the blood. They could see how serious this was. The young woman made the call. She stayed on the line with 911 and gave them the location. Within minutes, paramedics arrived. They assessed Deborah's condition, carefully loaded her onto a stretcher, and rushed her to the hospital. The young woman's hands were shaking as she watched the ambulance pull away, lights flashing in the darkness. The next day, she checked up on Deborah. Deborah had survived, but she was in really bad shape. The head injury had been serious, just as the young woman had feared. If Deborah had been put to bed as the younger colleague had suggested, there's no telling what might have happened. She could have slipped into a coma. She could have died alone in her hotel room, but surviving the injury wasn't the end of the story. The company's managers found out what had happened. They learned that Deborah had been hospitalized for overdrinking while technically at a work function. The optics were terrible. The liability was massive. The decision was swift and merciless. Deborah was fired on the spot. When word got out, everyone also learned that the young woman had been the one who insisted on calling the ambulance. The reaction was split down generational lines. The older employees praised her. They said she did the right thing. They said Deborah could have died if not for her quick thinking and moral courage. They treated her like a hero, but the younger employees saw it differently. They called her a snake. They accused her of getting Deborah fired on purpose because Deborah was competition in the cutthroat sales environment. They said she should have kept quiet, should have helped cover it up, should have protected a colleague instead of exposing her. They said she'd betrayed Deborah for her own career advancement. The young woman was devastated by the accusations. She hadn't called the ambulance to get Deborah fired. She'd called because Deborah was bleeding from the head and unconscious on the pavement. She'd called because it was the right thing to do, because saving a life mattered more than protecting someone's job. But now she was being painted as a villain, a backstabber, someone who had weaponized a medical emergency for personal gain. She replayed the moment over and over in her mind. The sound of Deborah's head hitting the pavement. The blood. The panic. If she had listened to the younger colleague and just put Deborah to bed, would Deborah have woken up the next morning? Or would they have found her dead in her hotel room, and been complicit in her death? The young woman knew she'd made the right choice. But the accusation that she'd done it maliciously, that she'd sacrificed Deborah's career for her own advancement, cut deep. She hadn't thought about the consequences for Deborah's job when she dialed 911. She'd only thought about keeping her alive. Was she wrong to call the ambulance? Should she have prioritized Deborah's career over her life? At what point does doing the right thing become the wrong thing in the eyes of your peers? What do you think about this situation? Was the young woman wrong to call 911 and potentially cost Deborah her job, or did she do the only right thing by saving her life? Should workplace loyalty ever outweigh medical emergencies? Share your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. Like, comment, share, and follow this page for more.